Welcome back to the Deep Dive, everybody. Today we're taking a deep dive into the work of John Dewey.
Mm-hmm.
She lived from 1859 to 1952.
Mm-hmm.
So he's a very influential figure in American thought. Maybe some people out there associate him mostly with education, but his influence goes way beyond that.
Oh, absolutely.
Really into psychology and democratic theory as well.
Yeah.
So what we really want to look at today is what was his vision for philosophy itself? Like, what should philosophers be doing, and why did he think that maybe the traditional approach was lacking something?
Well, that's a really interesting question, and it's something that Dewey thought about quite a bit. I mean, people tend to know him for his work in education,
Right.
progressive education, all that. But he was, first and foremost, a philosopher. And in this deep dive, we're going to focus on his metaphilosophy. His philosophy about philosophy. What is philosophy? What should philosophers be doing? And it's interesting because the term that he liked to use to describe his approach wasn't actually pragmatism or instrumentalism,
Right.
which are terms that people often associate with him.
Right.
The term he preferred was cultural naturalism.
Cultural naturalism. All right. So let's dive into that a little bit. What is cultural naturalism?
Mhm.
And how did that shape his view of what philosophers should be up to?
Right. Well, so cultural naturalism, it's related to pragmatism in the sense that it emphasizes the practical consequences of ideas, but it really stresses how human experience and thought are rooted in both the natural world and our cultural contexts.
Okay.
Right? We're not just disembodied minds floating around. We're in the world.
Right.
We're shaped by our environment. And so Dewey felt very strongly, and this is something that he shared with William James, that philosophy had become too abstract, too detached from the real world.
Too theoretical?
Yeah, too theoretical. And he wanted to bring philosophy back down to earth, so to speak.
Right.
To reconnect it with the problems and challenges that people face in their everyday lives.
So instead of philosophers being up in the ivory tower, he wants them to be out in the world dealing with real issues.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. He saw philosophy as fundamentally connected to education, but not just education in the narrow sense of, going to school.
Okay.
He called it education for living,
Right.
which was this idea that philosophy should be a tool for understanding and improving our shared social existence.
Right.
It should be a form of broad social criticism, a criticism of criticisms. So he wanted philosophers to be engaged with the world, to be thinking about how to make it better.
And you mentioned earlier that he had kind of a Darwinian perspective.
Right.
How did that shape his philosophy?
Yeah, so Dewey was very influenced by Darwin. He saw evolution as this ongoing process of adaptation,
Mm-hmm.
and he thought that philosophical inquiry was part of that process. So, organisms are constantly interacting with their environment, trying to solve problems, trying to survive, and thinking inquiry is part of how we do that.
Right.
Right. So it's not just this abstract, search for truth. It's a way of coping with the world. And this led him to be very critical of traditional philosophers who tended to abstract concepts from their real world contexts. They would take an idea like truth or beauty and try to define it in some absolute way.
Right.
But Dewey thought that that was a mistake. He thought that you couldn't understand these concepts apart from the situations in which they arise.
So he didn't like these kind of grand systems of thought that aim to find, the capital T truth out there.
No, not at all. He was very skeptical of that kind of approach. He thought it was too detached from experience. He was much more interested in how ideas function in practice.
Okay.
And this is related to another key insight of his. He rejected these traditional dualisms that had dominated Western philosophy. Things like mind versus body, nature versus culture, individual versus society. He didn't see these as fundamental divisions. He thought they were interconnected.
Right.
The mind is not separate from the body. It's part of the body.
Right.
And culture is not separate from nature. It arises from nature, and so on. So he was trying to overcome these artificial separations that he thought were getting in the way of understanding how we actually experience the world.
Okay, so if he rejected those distinctions, how did that affect his view of knowledge itself?
Yeah, well, Dewey had a very different view of knowledge than many traditional philosophers. He didn't see it as this kind of passive reflection of reality,
Okay.
where we just kind of look out at the world and take in information. He saw it as much more active.
Mhm.
He thought that knowing was something that organisms do.
Oh,
It's a way of coping with the world, of solving problems. And he thought that the mind was not just a mirror, but it was an instrument. Hence the term instrumentalism. It's a tool that we use to interact with the world. And ideas, he thought, are not these abstract representations of reality. They're tools that we use to solve problems. And so the value of an idea is not determined by whether it's true in some absolute sense.
Right.
It's determined by whether it works. Does it help us to solve the problem that we're facing?
So it's not just about like having correct facts in your head. It's more about how you use those facts, how you apply them to the world.
Exactly. Yeah, it's about what you do with your knowledge. And so Dewey's view of knowledge was very much tied to his view of action.
Okay.
And this is why he was so interested in education, because he thought that education was the process of learning how to act intelligently in the world.
So for him, knowing and doing are really closely intertwined.
Yeah, absolutely. They're inseparable.
And the outline mentions that, he wasn't just an academic philosopher. He was very active in public life as well.
Oh, yeah.
How did his philosophical ideas play out in his social and political activism?
Right. Well, Dewey was very much a public intellectual. He was engaged in all sorts of social and political issues. He wrote about democracy, about economics, about race relations, about women's suffrage, about education, about war and peace.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, he was involved in a lot of stuff, and he saw all of these issues as connected to his philosophical ideas.
Okay.
He thought that philosophy should have practical consequences. It should make a difference in the world. And so he tried to use his philosophical insights to address these real-world problems. And I think one of the interesting things about Dewey is that he had this kind of back and forth between theory and practice.
Okay.
So he would develop these philosophical ideas, but then he would go out and test them in the world. He would work with people in the Hull House settlement in Chicago, for example.
Okay.
And he would see how his ideas worked in practice. And then he would come back and revise his theories based on what he learned.
So it was kind of a constant process of refinement.
Exactly. Yeah, he was always learning, always adapting.
And this practical engagement, I imagine, is a big part of why his ideas have been so influential.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, his work has had a huge impact on education, of course.
Right.
But also on political theory, on social work, on aesthetics, on environmentalism. I mean, his ideas have really resonated with people in a lot of different fields.
So to kind of bring it all together, what would you say is the core message of Dewey's philosophy?
Well, I think the core message is that philosophy should be grounded in experience.
Okay.
It should be engaged with the world. It should be about solving problems, and it should be about making life better for people.
So not just this abstract, detached pursuit of truth.
No, not at all. It's much more practical than that. And I think that's what makes Dewey's philosophy so relevant today.
Yeah, because we're facing all sorts of challenges in the world today.
We are.
And we need ideas that can help us to address those challenges.
Right.
And Dewey's philosophy, I think, gives us a way of thinking about knowledge and action that can be really helpful in that regard.
Absolutely.
So it's not just about knowing things. It's about what you do with that knowledge,
Yeah.
how you use it to make a difference in the world. And I think that's a really powerful message.
It is.
So thinking about what we've talked about today, how could viewing philosophical inquiry as this kind of active adaptation, this problem-solving process, how could that change the way that we approach knowledge and understanding in our own lives? What role can we each play in bridging the gap between these, sometimes abstract ideas and the realities that we face every day?
That's a great question. And I think it's one that Dewey would have wanted us to grapple with.
Yeah. Well, this has been a really fascinating deep dive.
It has.
Thanks so much for sharing your expertise.
It's been my pleasure.